little behind, fair enough, but you know what? This is all about taking things slow. I think that's one of the things that comes out of our point, being a little more slow and promoting community. Ardo, I'm so glad that there's so many of you here and talking to each other. We also intentionally did not make this hybrid available so that people would have to be here and engage and be present with each other. And I think it's really important, and that's something that we put at center of this volume as we'll try and talk about. So I'm going to open up with some remarks. We have lots of thank yous, important people that played different roles in this that I want to acknowledge. I also want to acknowledge all of our contributors. So I'm going to give moments for them to talk through who they are and what they contributed. And then we will talk through from each of us from our panel. We have also one of our editors, like Steve Fuentes, who will be joining us virtually. But we'll each take a few moments to share some of our work, some of our contributions, and then we'll open up the forum for questions, conversation, and just engagement more broadly. So again, thank you all for being here. I'm Bill Marcantonio. I'm faculty at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies and the Keough School of Global Affairs, and also at the Mendoza College of Business. I had the privilege of being one of the facilitators for this volume and bringing this community together, but it was a group effort for sure. A special thanks to the Kroc Institute who supported this good work. Especially Asher Kaufman, our director, who was very supportive of it in the process, and our executive director, Aaron Corcoran, who I see over there. Thank you, Aaron. And also Janine Giesiak, who did much to help us in the coordination of our initial workshop that we did 2.5 years ago now, something like that, together. And also Juan Flores for helping us in the financial component, especially to make this volume open access and going through that process so that anyone can access it for free through Cambridge's website. If you haven't done that, I would suggest please do. And then Ari Woodworth is back there for coordinating all of this event today for us and getting everybody here, which is immensely important. So thank you. Also want to thank the Institute for Climate and Peace. When we did the initial workshop to try and bring together people who were interested in engaging and contributing to this project, we invited them to be part of the project and help us think about other ways of knowing and engagement to open up our community and get to know each other, and also to think about environmental violence. Maya Sotera-Nye, who is there, and Keough Fox and Zelda Keller, who all participated in the process in the workshop and who run ICP, as well as Justin DeLeon, Polly Walker, and Cindy Cohen, who led us through a series of exercises that opened us up and allowed us to explore and engage more deeply this idea of environmental violence that we wanted to coalesce around and articulate together, challenge, get to know, think about different ways of applying it. But it really came down to thinking about other ways of knowing. And I was going to invite John Paul to speak a little bit about it in a few moments.
This particular piece, we were during COVID when a lot of these conversations came together, and all of you know that we kind of meet each other by way of, is this?
It's not working, yeah.
I can keep you.
Turn it on, okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Still not.
This one fun.
Maybe I'll just talk louder.
There we go.
Okay, raise your hand in the back if you can't hear me well.
We do, Eugene.
Okay, there is one.
Good.
Come forward, there's a seat empty up here. So on Zoom, one of the questions we had was the topics that we're exploring are so complex that they require us to be cognizant of how much we need each other's ways of knowing and being across very different vantage points, from people that are embedded in places that are deeply affected immediately, to just in the indigenous, which can have wide variety to ceremony and other things. So part of what the Institute, the person who was here with us from that location, was the title we gave it was a way to open our conversation, was braiding our ways of knowing, sort of taking the Robin Himmer's notion. And we changed that at one point to braiding our ways of being. How to do that on Zoom is really complicated, but we actually experimented a bit with an opening that included ceremony, included the arts. We had extraordinary woman, Jane Sapp, who is a civil rights leader, led with a piece that she had written, a musical piece, that dated back to the civil rights era and the connection to nature and understanding where to travel, in particular the period of migration of slavery as it was happening and people were beginning to. That was not easy. one of my regrets is that at some point, I'm hopeful that we can find a way to land another piece of this, which would be how people with very different ways of being and knowing with different emplacements contribute insight into the complexity of what we're, wow, power has returned. So that was the gist of it, and I think it's really a deep sense of gratitude to especially the Institute and to my and Taylor, who helped me feel and Polly Walker, who's a little, from wider field of peace building. And Justin, who of course was here for a period of time in Notre Dame. So that was what I was going to add.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you. And some more thank yous that we owe to Humanity United, especially Melanie Greenberg for supporting this work. That's who helped us fund both the workshop and the open access option through Cambridge. And the Cambridge University Press, our editor there, Matt Lloyd. It's our third project with him, and he's just been a phenomenal supporter to the work. I just want to acknowledge then all of the people who contributed to our volume. I'm not going to read off each of their bios. That would be way too long, but I do want to mention where they are and their stage to show both the diversity of who came together, where they came from, and what they do. Because I think that's one of the powers of this volume is that the groups, even within some of the chapters, some of the diversity that's present. So in our geographies of environmental violence, we had a article or a chapter on Chernobyl body politics and making environmental violence visible. This was written by Nathaniel Ray Pickett, a PhD student in the Department of Geography and Atmospheric Sciences at University of Kansas. And Shannon O'Lear is a professor of geography at the University of Kansas. We had Cleaning Our Messes, the unprotected workers keeping climate change at bay from Jessica McManus-Warnell. She's a teaching professor of management and organization at the University of Notre Dame, so here at the Mendoza College of Business. We had Inuit, Nunavut, and the Blue Pacific, counter-mapping and counter-narrating indigenous space in the Arctic and the Pacific Ocean by Lydia Schaffner, who was a visiting fellow at the Kroc Institute and is now a lead researcher and activist at Narratives Inc. in Canada, working with First Nations groups. And we had Maya Jaskowski, who I'll read a more full bio for in just a bit, who wrote the Prior Consultation and Latin American Extratives, Structural Forces Behind Environmental Violence. And she's a professor of politics and international affairs at Northern Arizona University. We had Sonia Schoenberg, who wrote Radiological Risk Imposition of Environmental Violence, a case study of nuclear harms and the limits of legal regress in French Polynesia. She's a JD and PhD student at Stanford in their history department and one at the Yale School of Law, joint program. We have Alice Damiano in our section on critical engagement of and with environmental violence, where we actually asked people to critique the model that we were including. So we do have some detractors in here. Hello. But it very much showed how none of these are static and they're always evolving in how we might think about it and what it needs to apply to. For example, many point to the needing to include beyond the human in this and multi-species analysis. And there's differentiation across the group on that. But Alice wrote Sustainable Development, how its pursuit relates to environmental violence and why we should replace it with the concept of sustainable life. Alice is a teaching fellow at the School of Earth and Environment at the University of Leeds. And we have the affluence, technology, connection, and the struggle for sustainability, which we will hear a bit more about today from John Mulrow. I'll read again his bio a bit later. We also had Alex Jensen on that piece as a researcher and project coordinator at Local Futures. And Daniel Horn Greenfield, who's a PhD student in ecological economics at Concordia University. And we had a chapter on epistemic and environmental violence in Latin American environmental decolonial thought. That's Luis Pena, who many of you might remember, was also a Kroc visiting fellow for a year, and is now an associated researcher and coordinator at the Catholic University of Eichstätt-Ingolstadt at Central Institute for Latin American Studies. We had a chapter on degrowth perspective on environmental violence. Did anyone attend the degrowth talk just before here? I know you did. You had to, you're awesome. But anyone else? So that was from John, and we talked about a bit, just founded the Degrowth Institute in Chicago. But a degrowth perspective on environmental violence by Mariam Abazari, who's now a postdoctoral. Because I did not bring the piece of paper. So Augustine Fuentes was faculty member here at the Kroc Institute, or sorry, at the Department of Anthropology, and is now at the University of Princeton, where he's a professor of anthropology, and was a major force behind the thinking of environmental violence as my doctoral advisor. And we've continued on in our collaborations, thankfully. It's a great mind to think with. And I'll invite Augustine now to speak.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Good.
Yes.
Okay, I lost you. I was stuck in a Zoom void there for a moment, so I didn't say anything for the last few minutes. So I can't see you. So yell out if I cut out or you can't hear me. Okay.
Okay.
Cool. Anyways, so thanks so much for the invitation to be there, and I wish I could have been there in purpose. I had the great honor of being at Notre Dame for many years and being an associate faculty with the Kroc Center for Peace Studies as well. But it has been really an incredible opportunity to work with John Paul and Drew, Richard, on this project together and all of the different scholars, and to read through and think through sort of the diverse perspectives and engagements with environmental violence. So what I'd like to do for you really briefly here is sort of frame a little bit of why we all, but since I'm talking, I'll just speak for myself, really think this environmental violence focus is truly important. From climate change to toxic pollution and the interactive effects of multiple pollution streams, right? Human health is under siege right now in 2024 and has been for some time. Human-produced environmental risks to health and well-being are high right now, and they're contributing to patterns of global morbidity, mortality, economic inequality, displacement, insecurity, and I could keep going, right? The implications of human-produced environmental harms, excess pollution, different kinds of pollution and impact, are very complex, just as their causes are. And so thinking about how to engage this beyond a piecemeal approach, right? Moving past trying to identify a particular case of trauma or a particular case of resilience or a particular sort of environmental factor impacting particular scenarios. While all of those details in that focus study is important, a broader systems approach is absolutely critical. So I think this environmental violence approach that we're sort of promulgating in this book, of multiple voices, of multiple disciplines, of people inside and outside the academy, all centered around trying to talk about holistic and systemic dynamics with case studies, right, with specific examples of broader environmental violences and their relations, structuring impacts on humans and other species is really important. And I just want to nod to a few things here. The one I think is very important, that environmental violence, this broader systemic focus on these multiple dynamics from multiple disciplines, or really a transdisciplinary frame, lets us move, which I think is very important, particularly for peace studies, beyond trauma or resilience as sites of focus, to think about dynamic systems and the complexities therein without isolating a kind of our focus or our narratives around these particular things. And here, thinking about diverse voices and diverse means of both analysis and dissemination of our findings, right, becomes very, very powerful. And I think in this edited volume, what you'll see is multiple voices thinking through these sort of very complex systemic dynamics from different perspectives and in different ways of relating them. And I think that's very important. I think there's two things that are striking me right now, thinking with this environmental violence context. And the first is, of course, I was just a few weeks ago or a week ago, I don't know, time is structured strangely, in the path of Hurricane Helene in the southeastern United States. And so being part of that dynamic and process and thinking in an environmental violence context, thinking not just about the incredible detriment to human life, human economics, and the infrastructure, but thinking about what was happening in the sort of post-Helene impact when we see the distribution of an enormous array of toxic pollutants into not just waterways, but into soils, into the air, and into different types of contexts in ways that were not envisioned or predicted, right, by many of those deploying these different kinds of chemicals, frames, and structures. So the destruction ushered in by this sort of, I would argue, anthropogenically climate-enhanced hurricane facilitated the exposure and explosion in a diverse forms of toxic realities that we're going to be navigating for decades to come. And I think both the academy and sort of regional, local, and federal governments are not prepared to think through what these multiple levels of toxic pollution in response to these cataclysmic events is going to do. The other thing that's been heavy on probably all of our minds and hearts is the horrors of the situation in Palestine that's ongoing right now and now throughout the entire region. And while we can talk a lot about many just complex, horrific components, I want to remind everyone that warfare, particularly warfare that involves aerial bombardment and destruction, large-scale destruction of areas, consists of a particular kind of structured toxicity that has lasting effects on soils, on local and high-level climate contexts, that is atmospheric structures, on deep water and other pathways, and on multiple species. I think the environmental systems approach forces us not to ignore the deep, severely troubling, but engageable complex systems dynamics of these kinds of events. And there's many others that are less dramatic that we could talk about. And there's many really good examples in this book, in all of the chapters, of scholars, activists, poets, trying to think through this and figure ways not only to best approach it collaboratively, but to think about how we understand these environmental violences in order to do something or some things to mediate them in the future. And the last thing I want to say is that, peace building by necessity is a transdisciplinary engagement. And so when we think of the, let's say, ecological science or sort of biological dynamics about bodies and soils and forests in context with artistic representations of those relations, in context with poetic renderings of those, in context of multiple languages, modes, and peoples, ways of expressing these things, I think we come to a more complex reality or set of solutions, but ones that I think have a much higher potential for a kind of sustainable impact. And I would argue, and I hope many of you agree, that the goal of the peace building enterprise is often sustainability. And I think sometimes we forget that that's an active process that's ongoing and never just one off. So environmental violence, this volume, I think, offers insight, engagement, and hopefully a stimulus to more scholars and people outside the academy to think with these processes and dynamics. And it's been just a joy to be part of that. So I will leave it there.
Thank you, Augustine, for that. And I am going to now read the bio that I meant to read. Due diligence, everyone. Professor Fuentes is an anthropologist whose research focuses on biosocial, delving into the entanglement of biological systems with the social and cultural lives of humans, our ancestors, and a few of the other animals with whom humanity shares close relations. From chasing monkeys in jungles and cities to exploring the lives of our evolutionary ancestors to examining human health, behavior, and diversity across the globe, Professor Fuentes is interested in the big questions and the small details of what makes humans and our close relations tick. Okay. Next presenter will be Maya Jaskowski. Maya is coming to us from Northern Arizona University, where she is a professor of politics and international affairs and specializes in state-society relations and organizational dynamics within the state. She's the author of The Politics of Extraction, Territorial Rights, Participatory Institutions in Conflict in Latin America, and Military Politics and Democracy in the Andes, and articles in numerous academic journals. She's co-authored and co-edited American Crossings, Border Politics in the Western Hemisphere, and the special issue Development Elites, Impacted Communities and Environmental Governance in Latin America, which she just presented yesterday for the here at the Kellogg Institute for Studies in Comparative and International Development, hosted here at the University of Notre Dame.
Thank you for that introduction and for the invitation. I want to thank very briefly the Keough School, the Kellogg Institute, and the Kroc Institute for bringing me here. It's such a pleasure to be here to share my research today. I will be presenting on my chapter, and it was lovely to participate in this very interdisciplinary and very interdisciplinary project. It was wonderful and very unique for me. So I'm going to be presenting my chapter. It focuses on prior consultation. This is a participatory institution that is designed to bring Indigenous peoples into conversations about development that impacts them. The institution is meant to respect Indigenous lands, Indigenous autonomies, and take very seriously environmental impacts on Indigenous communities. My chapter is about how state agencies can use this institution to do the opposite, to downplay environmental impacts on communities and disregard their land rights and their autonomies. Okay. In terms of where it fits within the volume's causal diagram. This is the system, this is Marc Antonio et al.'s diagram, but my work fits right here. And I look at how structural violence can feed into and fuel environmental violence. And in my chapter, what am I talking about in terms of environmental violence? Concretely, impacts of extraction and extractive development on Indigenous communities. And the structural violence I consider, the structural violence the book treats as policies that lead to greater risks to certain groups of people. And so I'm looking at the downplaying of environmental harms to Indigenous peoples. And I also look in the chapter at institutional factors that drive this structural violence. And it's the combination of prior consultation and extractivist state agencies, I argue, that lead to this structural violence. So prior consultation, again, the state must consult Indigenous communities that are directly impacted by planned development. This is the norm. And it's grounded in the Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention, or ILO 169, which is a binding convention. And Latin America is really the place to study prior consultation, in my opinion. Of the 24 governments globally that have ratified the convention, 14 are from Latin America. Several Latin American governments have also regulated prior consultation, including in mining and hydrocarbons. So the right to prior consultation is not a veto power. So states must consult communities, but they don't need their permission to develop. Nonetheless, this is a meaningful institution. In other work, I find that communities have used prior consultation to hold up extraction. They do this by extending or lengthening the consultation process, or by refusing to participate in mandatory consultations. And so in this way, they can actually hold up extraction. So my point here is simply that this process can be a real hurdle for companies or state agencies that want to move forward with extraction. So there are many critiques in the interdisciplinary literature on prior consultation. First of all, many scholars point to the lack of formal veto power, also the lack of information for participating communities during consultation processes. There is the point that consultations can divide communities, and finally, states have skipped the consultation stage. And this is the kind of category that my work falls into, pointing out this. But more importantly, my chapter uncovers the mechanisms by which states avoid consulting communities, essentially their justifications for skipping prior consultation. So I find that extractivist state agencies avoid consultations through the following steps. They define narrowly the areas to which communities hold rights, and they also define narrowly project impacts on the environment. And so using these definitions, they can conclude that Indigenous communities are not directly impacted by development, and they can approve extraction and move forward without consulting the communities. So this is my crude diagram just for this presentation. It's not in the book. So how does the state agency determine direct impact on Indigenous communities? Well, one step is to figure out what areas are impacted by the development project. So drawing a boundary, some boundary that defines the area impacted. And also the state must define communal lands. So in this picture, we see that the area impacted by the oil development overlaps with the communal lands. And so therefore, the conclusion would be this community is impacted and prior consultation is needed. But what I find is that states like to draw things this way. To define project impacts, they'll often use this very technical term, area of direct influence. This is a term used in environmental licensing processes. It's the project site, essentially. And for determining Indigenous lands, they like to recognize only titled lands. And so if they draw the diagram this way, they find no overlap and prior consultation is not appropriate. And so this is the paper's argument. I look at 3 cases from Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia just to illustrate the dynamics. I don't have time to go through all of them. I'll say a couple comments about the Putumayo case. This is in southern Colombia. It was a case of a conflict in 2014. The Interior Ministry is in charge of leading prior consultations in Colombia. So the ministry went out and did field visits And they defined the project impacts as as essentially the area of direct influence. And they saw that no titled indigenous lands overlapped with that impacted area, and decided no consultation was necessary. The Environment Ministry accepted that and allowed the project to move forward. And this was an expansion project. It was to expand oil production in 3 oil fields. So to point out how interpretation can really vary, I wanted to highlight the Constitutional Court's interpretation of what was going on. The communities, in fact, saw themselves as impacted, and they went to the courts to demand a prior consultation process. Their case reached the highest court, the Constitutional Court, and the court said, the project impacts an area much larger than the area of direct influence, especially due to water and air, and kind of carrying the contaminants well beyond that technical space. And the court also said indigenous peoples have rights to their titled lands, but also other lands that they use for subsistence use and cultural purposes and other reasons. And so with these broader interpretations, the court said prior consultation was necessary. Now, I was also asked to think ahead, kind of look forward. What should we think of in the future in terms of the themes of prior consultation development and environmental violence? And I think there's increasingly more and more research being written on energy transitions and environmental impacts from these transitions, especially a great deal of attention to green infrastructure such as wind farms, as well as the extraction of lithium and rare earths. So what people are finding is, all of this development has impacts on communities, including indigenous communities, and we're also continuing to see a lack of high quality consultations or a lack of consultation altogether with this other type of extraction and development. So essentially we're seeing parallels and a continuation of the dynamics that we saw with hydrocarbons and other previous large scale mining. So thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to share this with you. Thank you.
I have the pleasure of introducing John Morrow. John is a degrowth researcher and organizer based in Chicago, Illinois. He's a co-founder of the Degrow US, executive director of the Degrowth Institute, and adjunct assistant professor of environmental and ecological engineering at Purdue University. He cares so much about degrowth that he left his primary faculty position to found the Institute in Chicago very recently. He's on this endeavor. His work is focused on improving environmental assessment methodology through perspectives that prioritize social equity and limits to growth. John.
How's this? Sound good. Thanks, Drew. Yeah, I care so much about degrowth that I'm also a White Sox fan. I say that to say I come from a big South Side Chicago family, and so it was really a pleasure to be invited to come speak here at Notre Dame. I was sending photos to my parents all morning. A chance to be near that stadium, right? I scored a lot more points doing that than talking about degrowth. But yeah, thank you, Drew, John Paul, Augustin, for organizing this volume. When Drew and I first talked about this, I don't know, 2 years ago, more than that. I kind of thought of it as a chance to get with a variety of friends outside of engineering. I've been an environmental scientist and an engineer pretty much, but starting to think about degrowth and realizing I had vocab catch up to do. So actually got Alice Damiano involved in her critique of sustainable development, and then worked with some friends across disciplines on the chapter called the Affluence Technology Connection, as well as the chapter A Degrowth Perspective on Environmental Violence. So I'll give my co-authors a little shout out later. And today I'm just going to focus on this affluence technology connection. And I've got more slides than I can do in 7 minutes because I gave a little talk this morning at the Environmental Humanities Initiative and had a little more time. So I'll skip over a few things, but we can always go back to them, I guess. Here's a story I want to tell that I think illustrates basically the whole thesis, the whole chapter. and it has to do with the Wright brothers. So this is the Wright flyer that flew the first sustained flight in 1903 at Kitty Hawk, built by the Wright, or built in Wilbur Wright. This would meet in, I'm proposing that this piece of technology would meet most of our modern definitions of a sustainable technology. They built their own custom, more efficient 8 horsepower engine in their bicycle shop. So they were bicycle shop owners. They built their own custom engine, more efficient than anything they could get on the market. So they improved energy efficiency. They used renewable energy. At the time, 1903 was just less than 10 years after the Niagara Power Station was opened. And with the massive scale up in hydropower across the US, and especially at Niagara, there was a ton of extra electricity generation. And yeah, we got Tesla's AC power system that sent electricity into the state of New York. But more importantly and more powerfully, we got the aluminum industry off the ground. Smelting aluminum requires electrolysis and a lot of electricity. So aluminum became a hugely affordable metal after the opening of the Niagara Power Station in the end of the 1800s. This allowed for lightweight engine blocks. So the reason the Wright flyer could get off the ground is because the engine block was made of aluminum. So that was renewable energy and new innovative lighter material. We're used to hearing of that as a sustainability achievement. And then finally, biomimicry. If you know sustainability buzzwords, you've heard biomimicry. We look at nature, we take inspiration from it, and we design our technologies to be supposedly more ecological and lighter on the environment by mimicking nature. Well, that's what the Wright brothers did. They spent 2 summers at Kitty Hawk prior to the 1903 studying seagulls and the way seagulls move their wings to provide lift based on their momentum and the wind. So they designed these airfoils, these adjustable airfoils, to be able to take advantage of the same system that seagulls have. So boom, the airplane is a sustainable technology by all these definitions. And here you go. Here's global CO2 emissions from aviation from 1940 to 2019. I put this up here just to make my point that what matters for sustainability is affluence, not technological design. But we have structured our solutions for sustainability around primarily approaches to technological design. The energy transition is all about alternative technologies. It's not really about alternative uses, ways of being and living together, which we talked about earlier, which is what it should be about. That's what I call the affluence technology connection. It relates to this famous IPAT equation: impact equals number of people times amount of activity per person times impact per activity. That middle factor, this is called the decomposition model, right? That's how we decompose impact into factors. But that middle factor, which is called affluence, activity per person, is affected by the technology factor. So when we make products more efficient, we also stimulate a rise in affluence. And that affluence technology connection has outdone a lot of our potential sustainability gains. So here's my connection to environmental violence. Sustainable technology concepts could combine to lessen our demands on the earth, could combine to lessen environmental violence, but their positive effect on affluence tends to outdo the potential gains. This affluence technology connection lies at the root of our global environmental conundrum. I'll just mention a few things that are in the paper, that are in the chapter. This is work that I've published looking at National Household Transportation Survey, showing that as we've made transportation technologies more efficient, we've also made them faster. When you've got faster speeds available, you travel more. That's a rise in affluence. That's an affluence technology connection. In my earlier seminar, I did a little demonstration. I've got my milling technology up here, which we can talk about later. But I had people grind coffee. This is from earlier. I had everyone grind coffee using different technologies. Mortar and pestle, 10,000-year-old technology, up to an electric grinder, 100-year-old technology. And I've done this exercise with plenty of crowds. And here's my data over many trials. The faster technologies, the technologies that grind coffee faster, are also the more energy efficient ones. So oftentimes we're pursuing energy efficiency and engineers can show you the metrics that show, hey, this XYZ is more efficient. But what they don't tell you, and where you might not notice after the economy adjusts, is that it's likely the technology also got faster. That's the case for home appliances, manufacturing equipment, and transportation technology. So I'll just leave this. This is my model of the affluence technology connection. Basically, here it is. We make things more efficient, thinking that we're going to reduce impact, but efficiency rises speed, which rises time and economic availability and economic resources. Also, we have a legal and cultural commitment to growing the economy every year. So even if we wanted to bank the savings for the ecology, we won't, because we're tied to growing the economy. We use that additional availability to do more stuff, and we undo the potential impact reductions. Last, I'll just close with saying, okay, what do you do? I've just done all these numbers. I've got several papers showing these numbers for different industries, showing this phenomenon. And that's what led me to the degrowth movement. And the degrowth movement advocates for a controlled reduction of the size of the economy for the purpose of meeting ecological sustainability and social justice goals. I'll leave it to the discussion to get into some of the ways that we at Purdue, I've got one of my former Purdue students, Jason Barahona, here in the crowd with me. He's also now at the Degrowth Institute with me in Chicago. This is some of the content that we produce to get engineers thinking about economic size. If you want to come up to Chicago or you find yourself up there, we're downtown. We have a physical place called the Degrowth Institute, bringing the degrowth movement and logic to the U.S. sustainability movement. And I will just acknowledge, you read the names of my co-authors earlier, but at the Degrowth Institute, my co-founder, Kate Meadows, at the Leadership for the Eco program at University of Vermont, and Jason Barahona, who's our program first staff member here in the crowd with us. Also a Goshen, Indiana native. So right down this road here. Thanks for coming out, Jason. All right. That's all I got.
Thank you. And for most folks in here, this person needs no introduction, but I'm going to anyways. Jean-Paul Lederach, widely known for his pioneering work in conflict transformation, is involved in conciliation work in Colombia, the Philippines, and Nepal, plus countries in East and West Africa. He's helped design and conduct training programs in 25 countries across 5 continents. In 2013, Lederach was appointed the director of the Peace Accord Matrix, now led by our own Josefina. Hello.
Yes, sorry.
Oh, good. Always at work. The Peace Accord Matrix at the Kroc Institute is a unique source of comparable data on all comprehensive peace agreements that have been signed since 1989. He has served as a senior fellow at Humanity United since 2015. He's the author of 28 books, including Reconcile, Conflict Transformation for Ordinary Christians, When Blood and Bones Cry Out, Journeys Through the Soundscape of Healing and Reconciliation, which he wrote with a close friend of many of us, Andrew Lederach, his daughter. The Moral Imagination, The Art and Soul of Building Peace, The Journey Towards Reconciliation, and Building Peace and Sustainable Reconciliation in Divided Societies. John Paul.
Yeah, thank you, Drew. And it's great to be with all of you. I had a bit of a conundrum because the piece that I wrote was written in the form of a century. And I have never read one of these centuries that I've written. They're numbered 1 to 100, and they permit you to kind of flow in a way of writing that moves between poetry and prose. Part of it was driven by a question I've been struggling with for some time, which is, if this century could speak, what would it say to us? And Drew thought I should read the whole thing, but I think that's well beyond my 7 to 8 minutes. So I think I'll start about halfway. Partly because where I want to start is a little personal journey of a time in my life when I was coming through a doctoral program. So this little century jumps all over the place. And I'll only add to this that when Drew was a doctoral student, he asked whether we could do a guided readings course. For those of you that are looking for ways to get the things that you really want, try guiding reading courses. And we started with trying to look at the questions, that I think eventually were formative for his dissertation. It's an interesting journey to watch something that for me opened up, and this is where this really goes, opened up what I consider to be blind spots in my own professional journey, which is, so this paper in some ways is partly confessional. The part that I haven't read would have one or two small pieces that would be useful to potentially know. One is that I walk every morning at dawn. It varies as the years change. And I discovered that there's a verb for that, which is gloaming, to gloam. It's a Scottish word, and it means to be present when either dark turns to dawn or dusk turns to dark. And the question I pose in the early part that I won't go to is, are we in this century gloaming? And if so, which? And that led me to look at the verb unsee, which is a complicated verb. So I'm going to start this reading simply by where I first heard the word used, to unsee. I first learned about unseeing from a friend in Sudan. It was the 1980s. We were living in a house of strangers in Belgium. Stranger is what the French call a foreigner. We were both strangers of the same age. We came from very different places. Strange friends always teach you the most about yourself. If you can learn to unsee. When he traversed from child to manhood, his elders marked his forehead and cheeks. Identity for life, belonging and separation placed at face value. I once asked him about the scars. It was hard for my eyes not to notice. When you first see me, you see the marks on my face. They speak to what home I came from. They say where I belong. But if you really want to see me, you have to unsee me. You must feel for what is here, but not fully visible behind the noise of what first appears in your eyes. The noise of our markers invisibilizes what sits in plain sight and silences the source's cry. Here we find the difference between disappearing something and unseeing something. Disappear, verb, to render what is present invisible, to take life. Unsee, verb, to notice what has been disappeared but truly matters, to bring alive. More than we know, we move through life with blinders and blinkers, these small curtains that rise around the edge of workhorses that keep them only seeing what they are drawn to see and not notice those things that may be present but cut from view. I confess, I have for too long profited in professional blinkers. I may not be alone. It seems relevant. It seems a relevant confession for borrowers, and vendors of the tunnels in this century. Noticing our blinkers sits at the heart of my imploring for the reading of this century, not the one I am writing, the one we are living. As I am writing in confessional mode, let me tell the story of how I learned to behold my professional winkers and my wandering ponder to unsee. Very unexpectedly, my revelations arrived in the guise of numbers. Scientists like numbers. I never much went the route of counting as the best way to assess what counts. I preferred the songs of rivers or the sounds of a wheat field holding the Kansas wind. I soon found that these songs and sounds did not appear on my graduate school entry exam. And they did not bode well for the first semester pursuing the doctoring of philosophy, this unfolding path of seeking how and what to know, or at least to receive the blessings of the knowledge carriers that my path was correctly unfolding. Between me and my desire to become a doctor in the noble pursuit of understanding human conflict and how we forge peace, sat the required courses of statistics 101 and 102. Looking back, I think the only way I survived the long journey of sociologies, covetousness of the mathematicians used was Dr. Ray Kurzweil. In his last years of teaching, he had made it his challenge to help even poets behold the ubiquitous and wondrous nature of singing rivers all around us, even if they presented in numbers. He took me to the stairwell of Old Ketchum Hall on the campus of the University of Colorado, where decades of traveling feet had shaped the steps and handrails. If you listen close enough, you can hear the bell curve. For the time we sat under a tree, and he asked me to watch the play of shadow and light on the ground. Without looking up, he'd say, imagine the contours of relationships between the leaves, the wind, and the sun. Now, try telling a story about what you imagine. Statistics 101, a guidebook for unseeing. We have been counting away for decades in the study of war and peace. It may seem odd that a significant part of my peace studies field spends inordinate time counting and separating deaths. Sorting. We sort a lot. We examine categories in which to place the deaths of our fellow humans to create reliable comparisons. We need to know the difference between the square hole of war, the triangular hole of armed conflict, or say just the random and rather large circular hole that gathers homicides or suicides. Categories try to make sense of the messiness around us. I suppose it is the very nature of science to argue about place and fit. We would not want a triangular death to fall through a square hole. In the pursuit of comparisons and counting, at some point we opted for 25. 25 deaths attributed to organized violence between a government and, say, an insurgency. We can put this thing we count in the square hole of dyadic conflict called war. Numbers matter, number matters. But sometimes numbers numb you to death. It's a very noisy world out there. I speculate this may be why we need to unsee. We have so much noise that we can no longer notice. We cannot hear the rivers flow, or the winds catch the wheat, or the life in the death of it all. And then sometimes numbers startle you. Just recently, I got startled. Startled awake enough to notice my need to unsee. It started with crazy numbers, 90,000, 460,000, 9 million. Then came 960, 30, and 1. And they were all compiled by 2022. In 2020, across our globe, 460,000 people died in homicides. Between 2000 and 2020, on average, the 20-year block, on average, 90,000 people died per year due to war. The figure for organized violence in the year 21 rose to 119,000. In 2022, 9 million people, 9 million people died due to human-produced toxic pollutants released in the air, water, and ground. And that does not include the nanoplastics that now flow in our veins. Reviewing 960 articles between 2000 and 2020 in one of the most prestigious peer-reviewed peace studies journals, only 30 of those 960 articles discussed climate change. One article mentioned the link between peace and pollution. One. The mention was found in the annexed footnotes. Drew found it. The largest number of articles referred to some aspect of understanding the 90,000 deaths per year due to organized violence, where we count the cases starting with 25. Something seems askew. Nobody noticed the 9 million disappeared, invisibilized, present, but unnoticed. I insist on single lines to stop your reading enough to behold. In the first 20 years of this century, violence from wars averaged less than 100,000 per year. Violence from human-produced toxins took 9 million lives in 2020. My cherished peace and conflict studies appears to dwell in a century of burrowing and borrowing, and I am hardly exempt. We counted wars. We needed a dozen deaths to find a square hole. We wrote books and volumes of articles about how to prevent war and how to end it. We did not write about the 9 million. Their rounded lives did not fit in our square hole. If they had all died in one location, if they were of one religion, one language, one ethnicity, if it was considered organized, visible violence, we could call this a genocide. But we are not sure what shape these 9 million will be. That's the thing about numbness. If we can't feel it, we can't count it. And then it falls through the net silently. Our humanity fell through the net, storyless. Environmental silence, now the midwife of environmental violence. How do we unsee environmental violence? I suppose this century I'm writing you wanders around the story of how I came to see my winkers and my long wandering ponder about the challenge of unseeing the 9 million. Why not poems about their lives? Why not articles and chapters and books about their legacies? Why not syllabi and degree programs on how to prevent and end the loss? Why do their numbers not matter? On my walks these days along Blue River, she seems to be singing her own numbers. This is the river where I live in Colorado. She's a small river by most comparisons, but she helps to feed 2 large reservoirs in Colorado that in turn feed our cities, not to mention the thirst-bound geographies across the Southwest. In 2022, the Summit County Water Commission wrote that Blue's annual flow had reduced what she shares with reservoirs, the ones that now sit at 24%. For every 1 degree of Fahrenheit rise in average global temperature, stream flows like blues reduce 3%. More numbers. Scientists like to imagine that numbers are objectively neutral, as if they enter our lives without feel or taste or smell. But some numbers are just salty, even when they flow in sweet water. Singing brooks have always been a metaphor of joy. Now what I hear feels as if it's the lament, seen by way of the dark ring on the rock bed shores, where our willow and cottonwood roots sit exposed. Some mornings I wonder, what would life be if blue disappeared? I imagine we'd have a crisis. We humans are calamity pensioned. I have noticed that river crises and the reporting on the crises of rivers has been making the 6 o'clock news. Climate strange does that. We always find the path to crisis and the way to crisis our way out of centuries. Listening to Blue, I've been wondering of centuries and crises, of joys and laments, of words and silence. I gloam, but can only find questions. A century of questions. Afterwards, I wonder where the words will go. After the seas have swallowed the islands and the fires lay smoldering drunk, I wonder where the words will go. After the forests sink the embers into smoky bogs and prepare for their long soak into muddy millennial crude, I wonder where the words will go. Will iridescent red-throated rufus still follow the irresistible pool of north and south and travel 4,000 miles back and forth each year? Will vermilion flycatcher change her name? For what will western osprey cry in early dawn when the Rocky Mountains no longer have lakes? Afterwards, will Indian paintbrush and thorny ocotillo and Mexican fire stick send their flames skyward? Or will they just blend in? And where will Columbine and Lily of the Valley heaven? After the winds exhaust their fury and laughing gulls no longer gather on Atlantic shores and the Sahel has sand duned the Niger River, I wonder where the words will go. Will robin's eggs still carry enough biliverdin to keep them blue? Will stately saguaro still trumpet white? Will redhead earthworm still come up for air? Will cirrus and lenticular and cumulonimbus still float the skies, even if no children flatten face up in the fields to watch them pass? Will thunder rage if nobody listens? Who will the devoted rippling waves of Lake Constant put to sleep? And where will manta ray dine when the plankton have dried? Will the southern fire ants still push up grains of sand when the earth itself takes on their name? Where in this wondrous world will all the words go after all? If we are to find the dawn, we will need to unsee beyond the noise and turn the ear of our hearts to gather the faces of the 9 million. They are us. The numbing, numbered fact is this: Climate change may slowly be arriving. Climate strange arrived long ago. This mix of global warming and humanly produced toxic pollution is not on the horizon. It is the invisible presence of lost life we have been gloaming in for years. We cannot disappear this crisis. We are surrounded by it. 9 million people falling through the net are too loud to be numbed. Thank you.
Now everyone can see why I asked to read the entire thing. So now with that, we will open up the floor to questions and comments any way that you would like to engage. I like.
I don't know how it's better to do it.
Oh, I guess for the recording.
Okay, thank you. My name is Oksana. I'm from Ukraine, and I work on documentary about environment and the influence of war. If to be true, how environment is also target in this war. And when I started to work on this story, at first it was something very, like, I don't know, conceptual, theoretical for me. But when I started under this topic to see the real stories and to feel the pain of nature that is like silent victim, and sometimes I also feel like I cannot cry anymore. People are dying every day, and I can't even find new words, and I'm not already anymore crying, even like these tragedies happening every day, because I have no tears anymore. In some point, I found that I'm still crying looking on animals dying, on like this after the Kakhovka, the Russian army blew up the Kakhovka Dam, and great territories were sink under the water, and people lost their villages, town, homes, like, and all the environmental change because of going under the water. It was like such a great tragedy. And when I was looking on these pictures and trying to understand what a great scream is behind these pictures, like what we can't hear, because when we can see something, sometimes we also can't hear, but it's screaming. And I also think that there is like very important point in what is going on in Ukraine, that it's really part of genocide, like making this land uninhabited, because people cannot more live there. This mined land doesn't bring harvest. The nuclear power station is occupied and bringing like really a lot of dangerous to all Europe. It's like minimal. And also there is some level of dangerous that we cannot even sometimes foresee. For example, my parents, they live closer to Polish border, and we, there is no safe territories in Ukraine, but we feel they're quite safe because like Ukraine is big and it's closer to Poland. And one day when I was already here, Russian missile hit the land in the city near my parents' town, and the air was polluted, and they couldn't go out from their home, from their house for 2 or 3 days. And sometimes, like, it's very unpredictable, because I was there. I spent like 2 months before coming here at my parents' house with my daughter, and I felt like quite safe there. And one day you just like wake up in the morning and you can't go out of your apartment because the air is polluted. So I think it's like very important to bring this issue of environment into the peace building, because it also suffers. And it's also like, yeah, we have very often like this very dualistic view about resilience and people suffering, but we don't see like the nature suffering. And nature is something that should unite all the mankind. And it's very important also to bring like peace building into this agenda of environmental protection, because it's also not there as I often feel. So thank you. I'm very interested in this book and will be happy to read.
Jem or Danya and then Jem.
Hi, all. Thanks so much for this presentation. I'm wondering what strategies you found to help people do that unseen. As I think we do take for granted like the system that we live in and the affluence that we live in that presupposes the level of toxicities and like destruction of it. Of the environment. So how would you communicate to others?
I can start with a little bit. Oh, yeah. I got it over here, sorry. Well, I think it's the quick bridge between the last point and this one that I wanted to say, and also shameless plug for the Chicago Degrowth book club, separate from the Institute, but there's a book club going on. They're reading Braiding Sweetgrass. It was referenced earlier by Robin Wall-Kimmerer. And the chapter we just read, she has a point about changing the language, and she has a friend, if anyone's read it, you might be able to recite it better, but she has a friend who has this habit of like going into her house and there's a bug under her hat. She's like, oh, someone is under my hat. Someone is, so rather than using it for animals and nature, using someone or, you know, even for a plant. Like someone's growing between the cracks on the sidewalk. In that personification, and I noticed like on the news with the barrage of missiles sent from Iran into Israel. What was reported that was hundreds of missiles. What was reported was no one died. Period. Move on. And if you've been around explosions before, you know a lot of stuff dies and is destroyed when an explosion goes off. The atmosphere, wherever it hit, the animals and things surviving. And I thought that was it was just this cultural reminder that we don't have the language to even describe or say, or no one would even think to report environmental damage in response to that. It was like, okay, no one died, move on. Thank God no one died, but the story moves on from there. And I'm not suggesting my own work, but I think that Robin Wall-Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, which is a bestseller. It's an obvious recommendation, but those types of connections, updating of our language are central to this whole effort. And I recommend that book if anyone hasn't read it. In addition to this one.
But so wandering around my little piece, one of the things that jumped out in this process that dates back a while of this conversation was how difficult it was to break through the existing categories of what is in and what is out, what's can be visibilized and seen and what's there. So Drew struggled, for example, to get articles accepted in journals because it didn't fit the categories. How do we, I think this is part of what we need to find ways to get a step back far enough to rethink some of the ways we're creating the categories and how we can imagine both bringing to and impacting those things that are present but not visible. And that remains, I think, so that's kind of within, obviously my confessions are within my own field. When you look at this book, it cuts across about a dozen, maybe 2 dozen fields and ways of doing that. And I think that's part of why it's useful to have these abilities to move across different lenses, different ways of seeing and being with it, because no one piece of this can be handled only by that way of doing it. It has to have a way that there is this, this connection, this interdependence. intersectionality that moves across it in ways that are really significant. And a lot of the discussions I think that we had is how do we actually hold that in a way that it can be received in the world, knowing that the categories are created would typically exclude them. But it took more intentionality in some ways to bring chunks of this together than we're accustomed to. But I think that's part of it is you can start with what you have access to and you can raise the questions right where you're at. And at least in my mind, a lot of this comes back to so much of noticing what's right around you is a starting point.
Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. My question to the panel is, how would you articulate the ethical dilemmas that you have seen in the cases or maybe present in the model or that you've seen in the prior consent model as well and even in the growth? So what I'm taking from from the conversation so far is there's a question about humans being thoroughly natural ourselves, not necessarily separate from the environment that's being damaged up there. But the damage is also happening in our bodies, as you suggested, in the nanoplastics phenomenon. So how can we kind of look at the ethics of that human and the environment as one, and perhaps united in interesting ways? And then the ethics of the process of degrowing versus competing interests of many different actors, for example. And thoroughly asymmetrical relations between indigenous peoples, for example, and states or corporations, right? Yeah, and overall model, how have you seen the ethical dilemmas being articulated in multiple contexts? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. In terms of ethical questions involving prior consultation, several arise. But let me start with the question about asymmetry and between Indigenous people and states. And it gets also to this question of categorization that John Paul brought up and the concepts applied. So one critique of prior consultation is that it frames the whole question in terms of, well, consultation, not consent, right? So suddenly the question of self-determination is off the table. And so there are a lot of, very effective critiques of prior consultation. Say we shouldn't be talking about that at all. We should be speaking in terms of self-determination of Indigenous peoples, which frames it in terms of how do they see the world, their connections to nature, what are their terms, how do they want? So in terms of, yes, there's asymmetries, and where I've seen Indigenous people exercise the most power in my book on this topic is when they're organized enough and unified enough to refuse to be consulted at all, and they take back power that way. And so they're using a participatory institution in a way it's not designed for, but it can be very effective. They're using it in a creative, procedural way. So that's kind of a comment about a couple of your points. And then I guess I'll just say one more thing at the ethical question. So I think with Indigenous politics, there's a tendency to assume that communities want to protect the environment in particular ways and in traditional ways. And I think we have to be very careful about that. There are many communities that want development. They want healthcare. They want roads. They want education through the state, communication, ties to the market economy. So it's very complicated, to engage this topic. Thank you.
One thing I'll add to that is that I think that one of the things we try and put forth in the book, and some of the ways that Augustine and I have articulated, is that I think that our ethics the ethic required to work against environmental violence requires a radical departure from the current human niche, and so a radical reconstruction of the current human niche. And we're stuck in a cycle of fundamentalism that's rooted in realism, political realism, as opposed to thinking potentially with the moral imagination of what are the possibilities, how do we actuate those. We're in a process of incrementally trying to address this issue when even the growth of it in incremental pace does not keep pace with. So, if it's a project onto the so the ethic requires much more than those most probably are doing completely.
I'll say, I know you guys talk about degrowth too, so I'll just toss a bit that I think fits, and also a recommendation for another chapter here in the book. But I have this list I go to of like frequently asked questions about degrowth and then frequently said responses that especially have to do with what degrowth is not. So I just want to give that list really quick. Degrowth is not less of everything across the board. So it's not take our current economic structure and shrink equal percentages of everything. It's a rebalancing, of course, and that's where the ethical questions come in. If it was shrink everything as it is, we would have a huge regressive policy on our hands that would be totally unfair. And we're seeing some of that play out in international climate politics. So degrowth is advocating for rebalancing, reparations as a path to a smaller global economy. Degrowth is not survivalism. It's not dropping out of society to start an eco village and not engage with the larger system. It's not going backward in time in technology and just going back to, I always say this, people who don't have a washing machine typically want a washing machine. But you find a lot of degrowthers saying we should hand wash and clothes dry our clothes. There's an ethical tough spot there where there's a lot of folks who've been living like that for a long time and want to develop rightfully. And then degrowth is not redefining growth. It's not green growth. It's not finding new metrics to grow. It's putting a cap on the size of the economy and doing democratically and justly. But on that cap, I wanted to mention chapter 16, materialistic lifestyles as facilitators of environmental violence. Can flow experiences offer an antidote by Amy Isham at Swansea. It's a really good chapter about how some of the things that humans most enjoy doing are the least material intensive. And there's a ton of opportunity to increase enjoyment of life for less. But in order to do that, it's going to create it's going to require an international commitment to degrowth in order to pay for potential savings. So that's the connection between, I recommend that chapter as well.
Yeah. And with Amy's chapter, if that was not true, we'd be in a lot of but her,
Yeah,
her
that's
letter
our ethical out.
is one of the sources of hope. That's why we intentionally put it as the last chapter in the book. We want to close with a hopeful message in the book. Doom and gloom. So it's maybe a time for one more. Anyway.
For giving me the opportunity. I'm from Pakistan and after listening to the book, like, I'm wondering what kind of discourse or case studies have you put in from the South Asia? Because if you see, they are the biggest target of the environmental violence from past couple of years, like Pakistan and India especially, they are the target of the climate change. And if we talk about the indigenous populations, the region from, I came from the south east of the Pakistan, and indigenous people in Balochistan, they're suffering because of the China's BRI project and the secret projects we have going on in Pakistan. So my question is like, you guys have included the case studies from Latin America. Have you incorporated the case studies from South Asia? And if not, what could be the pathways to bring those case studies into the climate discourse? Thank you.
For this particular volume, it is a geographic union. Some of them are global in nature from some of the chapters and how they're trying to just talk even about more human experience more broadly, human action. But geographically, case studies, there are none from Southeast Asia in this particular volume, more as a happenstance of folks who participated or not. But it is an important area that needs to be represented. We just were not able to bring authors together during that time period, which is a shortfall. There's many shortfalls, I think, throughout the book in what we didn't get that would have been optimal to really have a more broad, diverse, comprehensive representation. I think the invitation from the book and from all of us would be to continue the rhetoric. It doesn't stop. It's just a start point of trying to put this model out, this way of thinking about environmental violence, reconceptualizing this human action, pollution production as a form of violence. But if I would continue to work and think with it.
I might just add one piece, it sits a little outside of this volume, no volume can take it all on. But I think my experiences in Nepal in particular, which go to parts of that wider region, really a little bit larger, of watching how a movement began and grew around the notion of forest user groups, community forest user groups, and eventually to a federated community user. So that the fact that in a country that has approximately 28 million people, that 7 to 8 million of them participate in a local community forest protection group, that they're responsible across the diversity of that location, could rise with such capacity. Really began, I think, it offers a very interesting model of how people embedded in a particular location imagined ways in which they could make a difference where they live, but could see it emerge in a way that had probably greater capacity than the Ministry of Forestry did, just because of the ways that they had a deep rooted connection, but also were very much cognizant of how it was a part of their livelihood, and that they couldn't do it by the old patterns, that something new had to. So one of the questions would be, and here we can take volunteers across the room, might it be possible to imagine a volume of positive deviance? Places around the world where people are actually showing the way, connected to where they live, that would illustrate difference of approach, etc. Because one of the shortcomings of our book is using the title of violence, trying to understand what's there, places more emphasis on what's not going well than on what might. So that I think the invitation would be, pursue it. We need your examples from wherever it is, from Pakistan to wherever it is. I think my sense is they're there, but I go back to my notion, they're invisibilized. We don't offer forward the ways in which that which shines a light on the path that we need to find is actually seen. And so what we are seeing, we have to get through that noise. That's what I call the unseen. We have to get to a place where we can get to that which brings real life and aliveness. So maybe I'm going to turn my question back to you and say, why not do it? Why not bring it? Because I think they're there. Yeah.
Can I mention one thing?
Yes.
Drew? Real quick, there's a little section in chapter 7 on Ladakh, India. So northern section, but that defines the difference between modern appropriate technology and original appropriate technology. So my co-author Alex Jensen brought out some examples of what he calls original appropriate technology, which are adaptations that are made to make life better, but not to grow the economy. And that's the difference with a lot of the modern appropriate technology efforts we see. I did my undergrad at Stanford. We had a whole thing designed for extreme poverty, designed for extreme affordability, American students designing new things for developing countries. And it was kind of in the service of impact investing and growth. But he defines original technology with examples from Ladakh. So if you want to check that out, it's just a few pages, chapter 7.
All right, so we do have one.
One.
Well, thank you all for joining. We're going to hang around for a few more minutes. Anyone wants to chat, but thank you for being present and engaging.